So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Ian Scott Watson.
I first met Jimmy at our local Young Farmers Club. I was tootling on my way in fairly quickly in my TCMG when I was overtaken at breakneck speed by a Sunbeam Talbot 90. And when I got to the Young Farmers meeting car park, there it was, so I asked around and discovered it was Jim Clark. Well, I did know his father and his grandfather because they were quite near neighbours of one of the family farms that we had. However, we got chatting and got quite friendly, and he and I then mated up together and did quite a bit of club competition driving, starting with rallies, sprints, hill climbs. He was the world's worst passenger, so he wasn't a very good navigator. And I perhaps should tell you first of all a little story about a rally up in the Scottish Sporting Car Club ran up in the north of Scotland. And Jim was sitting beside me, and it got to one section where there was a lot of navigating to do, a lot of map reading to do, and over 4 different adjoining Ordnance Survey maps. No seat belts in those days, so Jim lays the maps out in the back seat, kneels on the passenger seat in the front, and shouts out the instructions, crossroads left, Y junction right, first left, until he said, right, quarter mile, turn left. And I could see, it was a bit of moorland, I could see for miles, and there was definitely no road there. So I said, don't be stupid, there's no road there. There is, definitely. I said, there isn't. So I jumped, screeched to a stop, grabbed the maps, looked for a bit of moorland on the map, realised where we'd gone wrong, and we were 8 miles off route on a 20-mile section. I was very annoyed because we'd been leading the rally at the time, so I spun the car around, told Jimmy to hold on, and I must admit I'm probably driving at 10/10, so a little bit worse than that. When we got to the checkpoint, we were within a few seconds of our time, and I shouted at Jimmy, get the route book, and nothing happened. And I just glanced to the side, and there he was, down almost onto the dashboard, covered in maps, and hiding from the crash he was certain was going to happen any moment. Then I entered for a race meeting at Trimond, which was a circuit up north of Aberdeen, and I didn't say anything, but we were in 2 races, and I entered Jim as reserve driver without telling him. And when we got to the circuit, his parents, I should explain, had said he wasn't to race. They'd let him rally, but he wasn't to go racing. So we get to this, gets to the circuit, and he said, what's this on the programme? I said, yes, well, right, you're driving in one of the races. So went out, I did my practice, and I thought I'd got as quick as I possibly could. And Jim goes out, and within 5 laps, he was 3 seconds a lap quicker than me. Well, I was entered for a handicap race, and the handicappers thought I'd been holding back, so I got totally handicapped out. Jimmy in the Scotch race, finished. It was a sports car race, he finished second last, but nevertheless, it was his first race and he enjoyed it. The DKW that I had, which was a fantastic little car with a 3-cylinder 2-stroke engine, and it really was a roller-bearing crankshaft, and it was remarkably quick. You just kept your foot on the throttle and you do 13,000 RPM, and Jimmy just revelled in it when he was driving it. But anyway, I thought it was time we had something a little bit better, and after a year, traded it in and bought a second-hand 1600 Super Porsche, which had originally belonged to Billy Cotton Sr., the band leader. So it had a distinct list to the driver's side. A week after I got the car, there was a race meeting at Charter Hall, and I'd lent the car to him, and it was entered. And competing in the race was Jock McBain, who had originated the original Border Reivers team, which had in fact been closed for a couple of years. And he had a Raymond Ray Zephyr, and he was a very good driver, Jock. And Jock and Jimmy had a great tussle. In fact, Jock Zephyr couldn't get near the Porsche. And the next week, Jock called Jimmy and I into his office and said, look, I'd like to resurrect the Reivers, buy another bigger car for Jim to drive if I would manage the team for them. And that's what we did. It went on from there, and he bought a D-type Jaguar. The first race in the D-type Jaguar was at Full Sutton. It was a circuit near York, an airfield circuit. Very fast, big, long. It was even faster than Silverstone, but it was like Silverstone. It was round the perimeter of this airfield. It was an Easter Friday meeting, and it was snowing and icy at home, and the other driver, Jimmy Summerall, refused to go. He said, "Don't be stupid, you know, there won't be any racing." But I phoned them up, and there was no snow at Full Sutton, so the BRSCC said, "The meeting's on." So Jimmy gets his farm lorry out, and we backed the D-type drove the D-type onto the lorry and set off. But by the time we got to Berwick, what had happened was that Jimmy, thinking he was thinking the lorry had been drained of water, the radiator, in fact, turned the tap and turned it the wrong way, and the water was still in it, it drained off, and it boiled dry before we got to Berwick, 8 miles down the road. So we backed up against the McBain's platform lift and backed the car onto that, and Jim set off to drive it behind me. I was leading in the Porsche because at least there was headlamps on the Porsche. There wasn't very much on the D-type. Set off for Full Sutton in amongst the ice and snow and everything. It was quite a memorable drive on this stretch of dual carriageway north of Borough Bridge. Jimmy came shooting past me doing way over 100, because I was doing 100 at the time. He was shooting past me as if I was standing still, and disappeared to the other end of the dual carriageway. And he told me afterwards that the spark plugs were oiling up, so I thought he'd better blow them out. We slept the night on the reclining seats in the Porsche because we were too late to get to the hotel. And in the next day, in the D-type, in a sports car race, Jimmy was the first person in the UK to win a sports car race at an average of over 100 miles an hour. It was quite an achievement for somebody in his very first race in the D-type. The Porsche was also there. I think we got first in the class in the Porsche as well. We went on from there. I'll have to have a look at the notes to tell you what I'm going to tell you next. Oh yes, I better tell you about this one. I had a bad car accident. A drunk pushed me off the road, and it was during the Suez crisis. And I bought myself a goggamobile because with a leg in plaster for 3 months, the seat was only about 6 inches above the floor, and I could sit in it and push the pedal back and forward with my leg in plaster. I lent it to Jimmy for a driving test meeting, but it had a very tight turning circle, and it didn't have a reverse gear. You stopped the engine, turned the ignition key the other way, and it started the engine in reverse. So it had 4 speeds back as well as 4 speeds forward. And Jimmy made full use of this and won the test thing, much to the chagrin of everybody else. It was very enjoyable. However, there was another occasion with the goggamobile that's worth telling you. I went to the young farmers meeting, and I was on crutches, so I let everybody else leave before I hobbled out of the meeting. And when I got out, the car park was empty, and the goggamobile was hanging on the railings. So not exactly what I expected to do when I got out. I cursed and swore and wondered how the heck I was going to get it off, but they were all, Jimmy, who'd been the man behind it obviously, was hiding up the road, and he came back down and gave me a hand off with it. But that was the sort of prank that he was quite capable of playing on me. After the D-type, a very successful season, but we entered for a race meeting at Spa. Now, Curie Costs advised us against going to it, but I'd already entered it, and both cars, and we went over there, and Jimmy, well, he enjoyed driving it, but he was a bit spoilt because about 2/3 of the way through the 1,000 kilometres race, the leaders, Maston Gregory and Archie Scott Brown, shot past him, lapped him. Now, he'd been driving pretty fast. It was only a 3.4 Jaguar we had, the others had 3.8 engines. And just after they passed, Archie Scott Brown went off the road, crashed and was killed. And I'd been at school with Archie, and he and Jimmy and I got on quite well together, so poor Jim was pretty upset about it, just as I was. However, we carried on, and the end of the season, Jock decided we should get a single-seater. So it was arranged to go down to Brands Hatch to test a Lotus 16. And when we got there, having gone down overnight, we discovered the entire works team, that was Innes Ireland, Cliff Allison, and sorry, I forget, my mind's gone blank. Graham Hill, sorry, of course, yes, were all there. And the 5 other people looking to have test drives, so they all got 10 laps. Jimmy was the last out, and Colin and I walked along to the timing pit that they used to have on the outside of Paddock Bend, and after 5 laps, Jimmy was lapping almost as quickly as the works drivers, and Chapman looked at me, he was jumping around, and said, "How have I not known about this bloke?" So I said, "Well, he's been driving at the ETAP this season." And he said, "Not bad for a wee lad who's never sat in a single seater, never been at Brands before." And Colin's face went ashen white. He called Jimmy in, and I was a bit upset, and so was Jimmy, because we were supposed to have had 10 laps. And Graham Hill jumped into the car, and 2 laps later the car crashed heavily, rear suspension broke. Now, if Jimmy had carried on and done those extra 2 laps and crashed, I'm sure Colin would have blamed him for it, would never have believed it was anything else but driver error. And Jimmy would probably never have driven for Lotus. Anyway, the Elite was being tested by Mike Costin at the same time, and I asked Colin if Jimmy could have a few laps in the Elite, and he and Mike agreed, and Jimmy went out, and 10 laps later came in with a grin from ear to ear and said, "Oh, that was far better than single-seater." And I had a mental aberration and said, "Okay, Jim, you buy the Porsche from me, and I'll buy you an Elite to race next year." And he wouldn't believe me, and I said, "Come on, shake hands," and we did, and that was that. Well, the next thing was Colin asked us to take the Elite to a race meeting on Boxing Day at Brands Hatch. And Colin and Mike Costin were both driving, and I'll never forget going through the paddock and discovering a row of bookies, just like a horse race meeting. And the odds were evens on Chapman, 3-1 Costin, 10-1 Clark. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, there might be a little bit of point of having a wee double here. So I put half a crown on. And a little bit further up the paddock, there was Mike and Colin arguing as to who was to win the race, which I thought was very funny. Each saying it was to be their last race, and their wives had told them not to, that they should not be raced anymore, and each of them wanted to have the last win. However, the race started, Jimmy went off first, there were all 3 of them in the front row, Jimmy went off first, and Colin tried for 9 laps, tried his damnedest to get past Jim, and it was only a back marker trying very hard to get out of the way that balked Jim for a second or 2 and let Colin through. And shortly after that, Colin asked if I would be prepared to enter the car for Le Mans. The Border Reeves would enter the car for Le Mans, and I said yes. And originally it was to be Jimmy and Tommy Dixon, but at Bolton Park early on in the season, the rear suspension housing broke and the strut came up through the bodywork. And I said, "There's no way that car's going to Le Mans." Even after it was repaired, I was just concerned that it might happen again. And Colin agreed to let us have another car with me with an option to buy it if it was in one piece at the end of Le Mans, and off we went. We went down to collect the car, which we'd been told would be ready on the Friday, and went down on the Monday, and when they got there, the car was nowhere near ready. They were still putting the engine in, and none of the other modifications had been done. In actual fact, it was the first car off the Cheshire production line. There was a car which was supposed to have been prepared for us before that. Nobody knows what happened to it, but I still reckon that maybe Colin must have taken it out for a spin that weekend and trashed it and hidden it rapidly in the scrapyard somewhere. Anyway, we went to Le Mans and got there, and of course we had 32 modifications to do to the car before it could be raced. By this time, Colin had insisted on John Whitmore being our Jimmy's co-driver, which in fact we were delighted with because both of them had been driving elites before and racing elites, and we knew each other a little bit. It was a terrific meeting, and about the second or third pit stop, it wouldn't start. And discovered after a wee while that the starter motor was obviously the problem. And the starter motor in the lead was underneath the manifolds, and we thought we were going to have to take the manifolds off to get the starter motor out, when Willie Griffiths, who had been Lotus's chief mechanic, came along with a brittle socket set, all welded together, with about 8 joints on it, and he threaded it down through the manifolds, unscrewed the starter motor, dug it out from below, threw it over the pit counter, and I had another new, we're not supposed to carry new pieces on the car, but anything that we replaced in that race we were supposed to have carried in the car. Anyway, I fished out another one, pretended to repair it, threw it back at Willie, who put it back on again and off. I think it was John, and that time went off. And the same thing happened again in the, after dawn. And of course, the French commissar in charge of the pit was watching all this. So we tied the old pail of soapy water, and it was hot when it came off, so we dipped it in, and I knew that the cold one down in the bottom of the pail was the new one. Pretended to repair it, handed it back, and as Jimmy pulled out, the French commissar gave me a great big slap on the back, and he says, "Very good acting!" And that shows the old entente cordiale that used to exist between France and Scotland still existed. I think if it had been the Team Lotus entry, we probably would have been banned there and then. Thereupon, after that, that was really, John will tell you a little bit more about the race. It really was a fantastic race, and it was very much Jim's introduction to real sport, because Chapman, after Boxing Day brands and the performance at Le Mans, was really looking very closely at Jim, and come the 1960 season, he was asked to join the Formula Junior team, and Jimmy was supposed to be joining the Aston Martin Formula 1 team. Jock and Reg Parnell were good friends, and Reg had put a lot of pressure on Jock to get Jimmy to drive for Aston's, but the Aston Martin was a dead loss, really. It didn't work, and eventually Jim was released to drive as a spare driver to John Surtees, because John was still motorcycle racing that year, and so off they went racing. Zandvoort was the first race, and John wasn't there, so then Monaco came along. Jimmy didn't get a race at Monaco because John was there, and then Spa the following week, and Jimmy practiced because John wasn't there. But it was a terrible meeting, as you probably all know, because Alan Stacey, their teammate, was killed when a bird hit him and broke his neck and crashed heavily. And Jim came down Burnham and found what he thought was a rag lying on the road, and a marshal dashed across and grabbed it, and it was Chris Bristow's body. Chris Bristow had crashed with Willie Mayress as well. Rather put a damper on the meeting, but anyway, Jim, he got over it eventually, and we carried on. He had a race for a Curie Cos that year, and that was the only time he was ever asked to drive for a Curie Cos. He was teamed with Maston Gregory, and Maston was really Jim's number, after the Spa being lapped by Maston, Maston was Jim's #1 hero. And it was rather staggering to him to discover that although the car was set up for Maston, and as Jim said, pretty undrivable, Jimmy was still a couple of seconds a lap quicker than Maston, and he couldn't believe it. And I remember the pair of us, after Jim had done the first stop, and Maston went out and was dropping gradually down he'd been in 4th place at the time, dropping gradually down the order. Jimmy saying, "What's wrong with everybody? They're so slow." And I said, "It's not that everybody's so slow, Jim, it's that you're so bloody fast." And I think he began to believe in himself. Honestly, for that first 2 or 3 seasons, the main thing I did was to instill in Jim a sense of confidence in himself. And he was as confident as anything he was on the track, but he wasn't confident that he was quicker than other people. But he gradually began to believe himself. And I'm probably running out of time here. Anyway, we did do Jim, the Border Reivers Aston Martin, which we DBR1 Aston, which we'd acquired, was entered for Le Mans in 1960 with Jim and Roy Salvadori as co-driver. They got on like a house on fire, but you know, the Aston Martin was only 8 miles an hour quicker than the Elite on the Mulsanne Straight. You know, they have a timer on the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans in those days. There was no chicane in halfway down the straight. And that's a staggering thought, to think that the little Lotus was as quick as that. There's another amusing little story I'll tell you just to finish. You may remember, some of you may remember, that there was a calendar done for Lotus which showed Jimmy sitting in front of a Lotus Elan, sitting on the bonnet. Well, what happened was they'd had a photographic session down south, and something wrong with the camera and it didn't work. And I bought the Elan by this time, which had been Jimmy's, and I got an urgent message to go polish it up, take it down to Jim's house, and the photographer would come up from London. Well, Jimmy was in his working clothes and he was shooting pigeons when I got there, and we had a wee chat, and the photographer arrived and Jimmy went off to change into his kilt and look a bit more presentable, leaving the shotgun beside the car. And when he came back in his kilt, whenever a pigeon flew over, Jim was out with the gun, and he was a hell of a good shot. And the poor old photographer was quaking in his shoes because he thought he was going to get shot next. Anyway, there's so many other things I could tell you, but I've got a time limit on me, and I think I'd better leave it to John to tell the rest of the story.
Great, and I just want to add in a few pieces that Ian left some space for. One thing I noticed that it seemed to be the way to get a drive with Lotus was to have a race against Colin, because that's how it actually happened. For me, I'd managed to get hold of one of these pre-production elites, which were being given to some of the known drivers, and but I had a friend called Alan Stacey who was works driver. He was a farmer close to me in Essex, and he managed to persuade Colin that I should have one of the early Lotus Elites. And in about my second race, it was the Daily Express Silverstone race, and I ended up racing against Colin in an Elite, and although he beat me, we had a pretty good race, and it was a result of that that 2 weeks later he called me up to ask if I'd drive at Le Mans with Jimmy. And of course, I mean, Jimmy was, as Ian said, was just starting at that time, and so this was a pretty exciting moment for both of us. It was interesting because the first race I'd ever done was in August the previous year, 1958. And when I first started racing, my objective in racing was to drive once at Le Mans. If I could achieve that in racing, that was absolutely the pinnacle for me. And here I was in June, less than 8 months later, being able to drive at Le Mans in I don't know whether we can call it a works Lotus or whether it's a Border Reivers Lotus, but in those days that somehow Colin managed to get other people to pay for the works cars anyway, so that's how it worked. And as Ian said, we had some quite considerable delays in the pits, changing starter motors in front of the French officials' noses. And what was interesting though was that there was two elites there, and Peter Riley and Peter Lumsden were driving the other elites, and in practice we had been considerably faster than them, and we couldn't really understand why. And it turned out later that our rev counter was 500 revs wrong, and we were actually using over the maximum revs that we were supposed to use all the time, simply because the rev counter was wrong, and that's why we were faster than the other car. Amazing to think both of these cars lasted 24 hours. We were finished first and second in the class. In those days, 24 hours was quite long for even a road Lotus to last for. So it was remarkable success. And that really, as Ian said, it was a very important race for Jim, it was a very important race for me, and Jimmy and I became very good friends and remained friends for many years and often drove together, because when Jimmy was driving Lotus Cortinas with the Team Lotus saloons, when he was also doing Formula One, when he had to do a Formula One race and couldn't drive the saloon, I would replace him in the saloon with his teammate Jack Sears. So Jack and I used to drive together there, and Jimmy and I were very good friends for a long time. As I said, we had the Scottish Embassy in London as my flat, and Jimmy would stay there a lot, and then he brought this young whippersnapper, Jackie Stewart, down sometimes. But one thing I just want to say about Jimmy that was very outstanding was that once he got into a car, he was incredibly focused and a quite extraordinary natural talent and great ability, and could put it all together in a very remarkable way. Outside a car, he was pretty hopeless. Ian's already talked about him sort of hiding in fear when Ian was driving. Well, I'm not surprised about that, by the way, but Jimmy couldn't make a decision. I mean, you know, if you at the Scottish Embassy, there were several restaurants around there and cinemas and that sort of thing. But if you wanted to say to Jim, "Let's go to a restaurant," you know, what sort of meal do you want? I mean, he couldn't decide about anything, and it's extraordinary. This very decisive person in the car was extraordinarily indecisive about his personal life, and it was just one of the strange characteristics that Jimmy had. The other thing was that he was very, he didn't like the press, I mean, the press was nothing like it is today. They weren't sort of overwhelming in the way they are today around the sport, but Jimmy really didn't like those kinds of interventions at all, and he was really quite shy and quite nervous, and it took him a long time to come out of that. And I was saying yesterday that I think probably Colin Chapman more than anyone else helped Jimmy to come out of that sort of shyness and be more out there in the world. There was just one other thing I sort of wanted to mention in relation to what Ian said, which was this extraordinary race in Spa. I don't know whether you remember that particular race, but it was rather worse than even Ian described, because it was this Formula One race in Spa, and in practice for the race, there was a fellow called Mike Taylor, who was also driving a Lotus at that time. And Mike went off and broke his neck in practice. Now, he survived. It was the end of his racing career, but he survived. And Mike was going to drive with in a Lotus Elite that had been specially built for Le Mans the following week. Mike was going to drive that car with Innes Ireland. And it was a special Lotus Elite. It was a 2-litre Lotus Elite, dry sump 2-litre engine. And Colin was very smart, and he picked up on this point that Ian made, that the Aston Martin was only 8 miles an hour on the straight faster than the Lotus Elite, because what happened was, in the sports cars in those days, the open sports cars, they had a very high windscreen on them, much higher than they needed to be, and that was very bad for the aerodynamics. And Colin had been smart enough to know that if you could get a little bit more horsepower in a Lotus Elite, it would actually be faster than anything else down the straight at Le Mans. So they built this 2-litre car, and funded by Mike Taylor's father, and Mike and Innes Ireland were going to drive this at Le Mans the following year, 1960. Well, Mike broke his neck in practice, and then in the race, what happened then, Mike Taylor's father said, would Alan Stacey now drive with Innes in this car? And so Alan accepted that, and in that very race, you know, literally a few hours later, Alan was killed when he hit a pheasant on the back straight at Spa and it broke his neck. And so that was the end of that. Now what also happened in that race was Sterling Moss went off and broke both his legs in a very bad accident, and Chris Bristow was then killed also, all in this one race. Now, what happened was that we all went to Le Mans the following week, and I was actually going to be reserve driver for the Aston Martin, and that's why I was there. I wasn't going to get a chance to drive it. I think I drove it once around the paddock or something to be able to say I'd driven the car, but there wasn't much chance of me driving because, you know, Jim and Roy Salvadori wouldn't drive the car. So what happened then was that Mike Costin came down to where I was in the pit and said, would I be interested in driving this 2-litre Elite? And I said, well, what's happening to it? Well, what had happened was that after Alan Stacey was killed, they asked Jonathan Seif, who was also a friend of theirs, if he would drive the 2-litre car. And he got into the 2-litre car in the practice and didn't like it. He was scared of it. They were also running a 1300cc Elite. So what Jonathan was going to do was to drive the 1300, and Mike Costin came round to ask me if I'd drive the 2-litre with Innes Ireland. So that's what we did. I went out in practice with the 2-litre. It was at night by now. It's the first time I'd driven the car. It was sort of quite late at night because I hadn't been asked before. And it was extremely quick. It was incredibly quick down the straight. Not wonderful handling, but it was a very, very fast car. And on my third lap, there was a horrendous sort of panic going on in the middle of the straight, where we were doing, actually in the Elite, I think it's true to say, I'm not sure, that we were doing 172 miles an hour in this Elite down the straight. But in the middle of the straight, there was a thing called the Hippodrome restaurant. And there was something had obviously gone on. I came in after seeing all that, came into the pits. They said, where's Jonathan Seif? And I said, I don't know, but could it have been this accident out on the straight? Yes, what had happened is Jonathan Seif had gone off in the 1300 now, Elite, and had a horrendous accident. And in fact, they took about 10 minutes to find him because the car was divided into 2 bits and one was on each side of the road and they couldn't find the body. And he went off to hospital and was very seriously ill. Roy Salvadori and I and then Sal all went off to hospital and everyone thought he was dying. So, extraordinary history about the people who are going to drive this 2-litre Lotus Elite. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I mean, first of all, Mike Taylor with a broken neck. Secondly, Jonathan Seif. Secondly, Alan Stacey was now dead. Third was Jonathan Seif, who was dying. And each of the 3 of them a week before had been asked to drive the car. And after we'd been in the hospital in Le Mans with Jonathan, and he'd been screaming and just in a terrible state, he really just looked on the verge of death. And Innes and I were sharing a room back in the hotel. We went back into the room. We were talking about this, and Innes said to me, I can't do this. He said, I just can't do this. This car is jinxed. And he said, if I decide to go ahead to this race, he said, you're the next one that's going to be killed. You know, it's just, I can't go ahead with this race. And I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm leaving now. And I had a mini van there, and he said, give me the key to your car, I'm going back to England. So in the middle of the night, Innes took my car and drove straight back to England and told me to tell them in the morning that he wasn't going to run the car, and that was it. So it was an extraordinary story, very emotional story, and I think it was probably the worst accident weekend of any time in racing was that series of races, and I was quite mixed up in the middle of that, so I thought I'd just share with you that rather strange story. So that was the sort of bad news. Let me just end with the sort of good news, because motor racing was pretty serious and pretty fast and pretty professional, but we also had a lot of fun in those days and we did a lot of sort of crazy things as well. And one of the things that I particularly remembered with Jimmy was a time when we were all racing Lotus Cortinas. This was in 1964, and Lotus Cortinas had won most of the championships in the European country saloon car championships. And so Walter Hayes of Ford's decided to give us the freedom of the town of Cortina in Italy. So we rented an aeroplane and took all the drivers, and we all went down to Cortina for a weekend. And we did what you obviously do, which is behave badly. And we sort of tore the hotel apart and various other things that one did as a racing driver in those days, because the death rate was very high, so you had to sort of celebrate in case you weren't there next weekend, And we did all that sort of thing. But at one time we found out that the Cortina would just, with about an inch to spare, would just fit in the trough of the bobsleigh run. And and the bobsleigh run sort of had some snow in the bottom and that sort of thing, because it was that time of year. We hadn't filled up with snow yet, but we could just get the Cortina into this. So we thought we should mention it to Walter Hayes, who was the director of Ford's at the time, and he said, it seems a pretty good idea to me. So we took this Cortina down the bobsleigh run, and it was quite exciting, and because you had no idea what was going to happen, either on the way down or when you got to the bottom. And but it worked, and none of us died. So we got two of them, and then we decided, with Walter Hayes' help, to take journalists down with us down this, and it scared the hell out of the journalists. But we had enormous fun with this, and what happened after a few runs, because when you get the G-forces, when you get on the banking, because we were up literally on the side when we were going around the banking occasionally. And what happened in the end is the struts came up through the bonnet, the front struts, and so we wrecked the cars. All the door handles were rubbed off on the side of the other things anyway. But they filmed the whole thing, and this was tremendous publicity. And there were two totally wrecked Cortinas, and but it was wonderful, wonderful publicity for Ford. We've still got some photographs. Do you have any of those photographs, Peter? Yeah. Wonderful photographs of this thing going down the bobsleigh run. So we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of injuries, a lot of accidents, a lot of deaths, a lot of fun too. So that was just a bit of a glimpse of the motorsport in those days. Okay.